We are now opening the first session in this afternoon with the first plenary speaker. That is Professor Francis Dickey, that I'm going to introduce to you. Professor Francis Dickey works in T.S. Eliot studies and teaches modernist literature at the University of Missouri. She is the author of The Modern Portrait Poem from Dante Gabriel Rossetti to Ezra Pound, and co-editor of Volume 3 of the Complete Prose of T.S. Eliot, the Edinburgh Companion to T.S. Eliot and the Arts, and T.S. Eliot Studies Annual. Past president of the International T.S. Eliot Society, she has published essays on modern poetry in Modernism, Modernity, in 20th century literature, in contemporary literature, and in New England Quarterly, and other venues. Recently, her blog and articles have been exploring the Eliot-Emily Hale correspondence, as well as the place of St. Louis in Eliot's writing. So, please, thank you. Just let me announce the title of the talk. That is, The Poet Who Wears His Heart on His Sleeve, The Wasteland and Eliot's Personal Theory of Poetry. Yeah.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you, Louis, and all of you for having me here. I'm honored to be with you today to talk about The Wasteland on the centennial of its first publication. This is an extraordinary moment for the poem and its readers. Instead of looking back retrospectively on the Wasteland's cultural and critical impact after 100 years of reading and study, Eliot scholars are just beginning to process an entirely new body of commentary written by Eliot that radically alters what we thought we knew about him and his poem. I am referring to the archive of 1,131 letters that Eliot wrote to his American muse, Emily Hale, from 1930 to 1956, which were unsealed in January 2020 at Princeton University Library. Eliot knew Hale in Cambridge, Massachusetts as early as 1905, and he fell in love with her in 1913. Thereafter, she remained a major presence in his emotional life, despite a gap of communication until 1930, when Eliot began writing to her regularly, telling her that, quote, "I shall always write primarily for you," unquote. In thousands of pages of clearly written, deeply felt letters, Eliot revealed his private life and his compositional process, as well as his opinions of other people, political views, day-to-day activities, and much else of interest. I was lucky to be one of the first people to read the archive, but I believe it will soon be publicly available at tseliot.com, and at that point, this complete scholarly reassessment of Eliot's work will begin in earnest. The opening of the archive has raised a million-dollar question, which every audience now asks me. What about Eliot's much-vaunted theory of personality, which has already been mentioned at least once today? Do his autobiographical interpretations of his own poems, newly revealed in these letters, call into question his claims that the emotion of art is impersonal, and that the progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality? It is perhaps needless to observe that tradition and the individual talent has long served as a critical whipping boy. The postmodern death of the author gave impersonality a second wind in the 1980s literary theory, but U.S. literary critics now mostly view any separation of author and text with grave suspicion. Indeed, our English curricula in the States are structured around the biographical identities of authors, using categories such as nationality, gender, and race. So the challenge to Eliot's theory of impersonality is hardly new, and I do not plan to take sides in the debate over its validity as a theory of poetry in general, which I think has pretty much been dispersed. As an editor of Eliot's Complete Prose, containing 1,000 other pieces of his criticism, I have made it a practice not to refer to this oversighted essay, but I'm making an exception now. The opening of the archive demands a reevaluation of his theory. I am intrigued by the apparent contradiction between tradition and the individual talent and Eliot's own account to Hale of the meaning of his poetry. Informed by his letters, my talk today examines how Eliot incorporated personal experience into his poetry, especially Gerontian and The Wasteland, trying to understand this process as transmutation, his word, or depersonalization, the terms that Eliot used. Now that we have more information about his experiences and intentions, we can draw some common sense conclusions about his compositional practice. Impersonality, I suggest, may be a high-toned abstraction for the poet's process of stripping out the detail from autobiographical moments while keeping the emotional core often rooted in specific words. Should we call this method personal or impersonal? That's ultimately a judgment call for each of us based on our sense of the meaning of these words. But Eliot also had a theory that was personal in another sense, as when in conversation people say, my personal theory is that. He offered one theory to the public in tradition, but kept another one just for himself and Hale. The famous passage about impersonality occurs in part 2 of Tradition and the Individual Talent. The business of the poet is not to find new emotions, but to use the ordinary ones and, in working them up into poetry, to express feelings which are not in actual emotions at all. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. But, of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. Although Eliot does say that the poet uses ordinary emotions in the composition of poetry, his claim for poetry as an escape from personality and a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality, long discouraged biographical readings that sought to find ordinary emotion behind his extraordinary texts. Yet, in a letter to Hale from March 1933, Eliot privately challenged those who would follow the critical principles he himself laid down in tradition. Sometimes I have thought of keeping a notebook, but I can't come to the point of putting things down just for myself or solemnly for posterity. I have to speak to somebody. This is the sort of thing that I would have put down in a notebook. Quote, "The poet wears his heart upon his sleeve." It must be added, first, that is the last place where anybody would think of looking for it, and second, that they wouldn't recognize it as a heart if they saw it. Unquote. I wonder if that means anything, though it seemed rather clever when I thought of it. The poet wears his heart upon his sleeve does not seem consistent with poetry is an escape from emotion. And this is only one of many places in his letters where he seems to violate the principles articulated in tradition. There is also a contradiction in spirit, of course, between his buttoned-up theory and the revelations of his letters. Yet, both the 1919 essay and his 1933 letter are characteristically elusive. In tradition, he allows the use of ordinary emotion, which is then transmuted into poetry. Quote, "The more perfect the artist, the more perfectly will the mind digest and transmute the passions which are its material." Unquote. In his letter, he carefully qualifies the words, "the poet wears his heart upon his sleeve," by placing them in quotation marks and wondering if they mean anything. In the privacy of his letter, Eliot gives in to the temptation to make Vedic pronunciations about poetry solemnly for posterity, while mocking himself, diminishing the significance of what he says about the poet's heart. I wonder if that means anything. Typically Eliotic, the self-revealing, self-concealing gestures in this letter don't cancel each other out. Rather, the embedded self-quotation mirrors his strategy of poetic composition, placing a reference to personal emotion or experience within a seemingly impersonal context that distances it from his life, drawing our attention instead towards ideas and literary history. As I have worked with the Hale material, I've come to the conclusion that when Eliot refers to the transmutation of emotions and personality into poetry, he is referring to this compositional strategy which he was developing at the time. While transmutation suggests a magical or at least a chemical transformation, Eliot was neither a sorcerer nor a scientist. He was a poet using poetic tools. Sometimes he merely changes or silences the name of a person or place brought into his poem. More often, he weaves abstractions and illusions around a passage of autobiography, creating a tapestry of suggestions leading in many directions away from his personal memory, which may ultimately adhere to just a few words. Eliot wrote Tradition in the wake of completing Gerontion, an enigmatic poem that rests on carefully concealed autobiography. In Gerontion and the Wasteland, as well as Four Quartets, we can trace the development of his strategy for writing about Hale and other people in his life without falsifying the experience, yet also without revealing their identities. In the end, Eliot wrote a concealed autobiography, as was his right to do, and Tradition offers a concealed explanation of his methods. We can better understand Eliot's theory of poetry, be it personal or impersonal, by placing Tradition in the context of Eliot's life. To quickly review his background, Eliot came to Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1905 from St. Louis for a year of pre-college study at Milton Academy. At that time, Emily Hale, the daughter of a Unitarian minister, was attending primary school in Cambridge with Eleanor Hinckley, Eliot's cousin, and it is likely that the two youngsters first saw each other at Eleanor's house in that early year. However, their relationship dates from his graduate years at Harvard, 1911 to 14, especially in the final academic year. In summer 1914, Eliot left the United States for further study in England, where he married Vivian Haywood and took up residence there, eventually becoming a British citizen. Their union quickly degenerated under the pressure of sexual incompatibility, her likely infidelity, her lifelong drug addiction recently revealed by Anne Pasternak Slater's biography, Eliot's overwork, and, as he later told Hale, the fact that he neither loved nor was even attracted to Vivian. On January 8, 1919, Eliot's father died unexpectedly. We tend to give this loss less significance than his unhappy marriage because he said little about it in his letters, but it was a catalyzing event for the writing that followed. Eliot later told Joyce that Henry Ware Eliot, quote, died still believing, I am sure, that I had made a complete mess of my life, which from his point of view, and possibly quite rightly, I had done. I cannot forget him sitting in the railway station before my last departure, looking completely broken. This vision haunts Gerontion, Eliot's first composition after his father's death. When Gerontion says, my house is a decayed house, we must allow the possibility that this statement refers to the house of Eliot. He revealed Gerontion's autobiographical content to Hale by telling her the identities of two of the poem's oddly named figures, Hakagawa and Mr. Silvero. In one letter, Eliot described his former friend, Matt Pritchard, assistant director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, as a strange, intense, fanatical fellow with an abnormal love of power over younger men, adding, offhandedly, in a poem called Gerontion, I referred to him as Mr. Silvero. Notice he doesn't say, I based the character of Mr. Silvero on Matt Pritchard. He just is Mr. Silvero. Hakagawa, he revealed to her in another letter, was Okakura Kakuzo, a curator of Asian art at the Museum of Fine Arts, both of whom he knew in Paris in 1910 to 11. In a copy of Poems 1920, owned by Lucy Thayer, Eliot annotated the names in Gerontion with lines to words that were later erased. This has long been known. This detail suggests that each name in the poem corresponds to a person in Eliot's life, suggesting that he viewed Gerontion as a kind of poème à clef, and that the transmutation in this case involved changing the names of people to conceal their identities. Perhaps transmutation is too lofty a word for changing Matt Pritchard to Mr. Silvero. But on the other hand, Mr. Silvero is admittedly a magical name evoking both slipperiness and refinement, qualities that Pritchard obviously possessed. Transmutation also works in other less obvious ways in the poem. It opens with an old man in a dry month being read to by a boy, figures who combine Henry Ware Eliot Sr. and his youngest son, Tom. The pair also combines two of Eliot's own identities in the way that the child is father of the man. He is both a son and a prematurely aged man contemplating his own mortality after the death of his father. The name Gerontian implies agedness in general, and indeed the poem does speak to a universal condition. But once we know that the other names refer to specific people in his life, it seems highly likely that Eliot's inspiration for the central figure lay in himself. The poem explores all the ways in which the son has made a mess of his life. Gerontian's vocabulary of fear and sin, depraved, confusion, fear, unnatural vices, impudent crimes, wrath, and terror suggests that the power struggle with Matt Pritchard and his vision of hell remained with Eliot and infused the poem. Yet by 1919, those events were well in the past. As the poem continues, Eliot turns his mind to the biggest mess of all, his failure to propose to Hale, his choice to marry Vivian instead. As he painfully explained to Hale in his second letter to her on November 3, 1930, he had married Vivian without loving her. "It is a greater sin to marry without any feeling at all, I consider," he wrote, "than to marry even from low passion. For a year I was merely dazed and numbed and did not know what was the matter. Then, quite suddenly, I awoke. Well, I did not know how much, if any, harm I had done to you, but I could know quite well the harm I had done, which was under my eyes, and I came to see that this, at all events, I must expiate with the rest of my life." Eliot's view of his marriage as a sin sheds new light on Gerontian's indefinite but pervasive sense of guilt. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? Unnatural vices are fathered by our heroism. Eliot was never close to Vivian. When he writes, "I that was near your heart was removed therefrom," he's not referring to his wife, but to Hale, whose presence he lost when he left America in 1914. On 17 June 1919, as he was completing this poem, Eliot wrote to his cousin Eleanor, "I have written to Emily. I hope it was a nice letter. I should, I think, like her to know what a keen interest I take in everything that happens to her." That is not a letter that is contained in the archive that's collected in the first volume of his letters. Mourning his father, his mind turned to Hale, just as it did in 1930 after the death of his mother, when he wrote, "Since my mother died, I have felt very much alone, and you will take some of her place for me too. I loved her very much and felt much sympathy with her, and like to think that you and she are somewhat alike." Not marrying Hale had led to the break that devastated his parents and separated him from them, and he now felt very alone in a situation that he had created. These lines in Gerontian dwell on the devastation Eliot felt when he awoke after marrying Vivian. "I that was near your heart was removed therefrom, to lose beauty in terror in inquisition." His account of their marriage as continual inquisition is recorded in The Wasteland, as the wife in A Game of Chess asks, "What are you thinking of? What? What thinking? What?" Each of the words in these lines, near, heart, removed, terror, and inquisition, has specific private meanings for Eliot. Yet that is true for us as readers too. We have our own associations with these powerful words, which we bring to the passage and shape our sense of its meaning. We don't think of the poet being subject to an inquisition by his wife, nor should we, but it is there. The poem continues, "I have lost my passion. Why should I need to keep it, since what is kept must be adulterated?" Attentive readers have long perceived adultery within the word adulterated, connecting it with Bertrand Russell's affair with Vivian, which Eliot may have discovered in spring 1919, a further blow following the death of his father. In thousands of pages of personal confession, Eliot never told Hale about this incident, whether through ignorance or a sense of privacy. There's still no definite evidence that he did know. But he did confess his own adultery with an unidentified woman whom Robert Crawford believes was Nancy Cunard. Eliot's use of the word adulterated in Gerontian both allows him to introduce experiences that are traumatic and socially shameful, while the connotations of the verb to adulterate point in other less personal directions, and the word only retains an aura of sexuality by its proximity to my passion. Passion, of course, was the feeling Eliot did not have towards his wife. He believed he had felt it towards Emily. Passion is also the word he uses in tradition. the transmutation of passions. In literary criticism, though we may try many different approaches, literal equivalences between the author's life and specific words of his or her text are often considered a breach of decorum. Biographical readings such as this have long been frowned upon for reducing the text to a kind of sordid puzzle with a disappointing solution. Yet Eliot specifically directed Hale to understand Gerontian as well as the Wasteland biographically. I think there is no way to understand Eliot's theory of poetry without acknowledging the literal references to his life submerged in a weird tapestry of words and allusions that we struggle to understand. What is Gerontian if not an attempt to escape from his tormented passions by transmuting them into poetry? The transmutation occurs in this poem by the simple device of changing people's names and weaving words freighted with personal significance, like adulterated, passion, crimes, etc., into a glittering web of sounds and indefinite connotations that can lead in many different directions. What came after his composition of this poem, I think, helps to explain Eliot's claims about impersonality. After completing Gerontian, but before its publication, Eliot received a letter from his friend Richard Aldington, to whom I believe he had showed Gerontian, telling him, "I dislike your poetry very much. It is over-intellectual and afraid of those essential emotions which make poetry." From Eliot's perspective, there was no more essential emotion than his agonized feelings of grief, guilt, and longing. But he could not afford to reveal the personal significance of his poem. When he received Aldington's letter, and Aldington was his friend, on July 18th or 19th, he was working on the first section of Tradition and Individual Talent, whose ideas about tradition he had been ruminating on throughout the spring and early summer, and which went to press shortly after his return in August from his walking tour in France. In fact, he may have finished it before he went to France. Eliot's reflections on tradition and the historical sense do not obviously lead to the topics of emotion and its transmutation. His first references to impersonality in the phrases extinction of personality and depersonalization only appeared in the final paragraphs of this section, perhaps added as an afterthought in response to Aldington. He developed the impersonal theory, which is not intrinsic to his ideas about tradition, in the second section published in December. How much of this second part of the essay exists to justify Gerontian's elaborately disguised autobiographical references and the wilderness of mirrors reflecting Eliot's personal misery? The irony of both his concept of impersonality and the poem's stylistic difficulty may be that Eliot all too successfully concealed the place of ordinary emotions in his poetry and his life. Or, as he wrote to Hale when trying to persuade her to allow him to preserve her letters, "There will be so much in existence to give a very false impression of me, and so few clues to the truth. I have again and again seen the impression I have made, and have longed to be able to cry, 'No, you all are wrong about me. It isn't like that at all. The truth is perfectly simple and intelligible, and here it is in a few words.'" Of course, he doesn't say what that truth is, at least not in this letter. But his initial letter of confession to Hale on November 3, 1930, comes as close as we are likely to get from any poet, the few words that sum up his poetry. "I want to convince you that my love for you has been the one great thing all through my life. Please reread the hyacinth lines in the Wasteland, and the lines toward the very end beginning, 'Friend, blood shaking my heart,' where we means privately, of course, I, and compare them with Pipit on the one hand," that's from A Cooking Egg, "and Ash Wednesday on the other, and see if they do not convince you that my love for you has steadily grown into something finer and finer, and I shall always write primarily for you." The hyacinth lines to which he refers, in case you don't have them right at the top of your mind, are as follows. "You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the hyacinth girl. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak, and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing, looking into the heart of light, the silence." Readers have often felt that this passage must capture a personal experience. Lyndall Gordon's 1988 biography, Eliot's New Life, has been proven extraordinarily right in identifying Hale as the Hyacinth Girl, the title of her new book. In one letter, Eliot referred to a crucial moment in summer 1914 when he almost revealed his feelings to her. At the end of the Saturday afternoon when I took you home, I was down in the mouth to think those delirious 2 days were over. It all seemed over, that I nearly spoke to you. I cannot allow my mind to dwell long on such things. A kind of dizziness overcomes me and interferes with my ability to carry on my daily life. From this letter, we learn that the word silence in the hyacinth garden, looking into the heart of light, the silence, probably originated in Eliot's failure to say anything to Hale at the right moment, a silence which the intervening years have fused with the kind of dizziness he still feels when he thinks about that moment. My eyes failed. I knew nothing. The lines from Wagner's opera Tristan und Isolde that frame the hyacinth garden passage in The Wasteland also reveal how Eliot's memories of Hale are overlaid with the feelings that accrued during his marriage. He and Hale attended a performance of Tristan in December 1913, an experience that awakened him to being in love with her, as he told her later. And we know the date of the performance they attended because he saved the program, which is in his papers at Houghton Library at Harvard. He wrote to Hale, "After that night at the opera, I was completely conscious of it and quite shaken to pieces." The lines "Frisch weht der Wind der Heimat zu" appear at the opening of the opera, preparing the scene for Tristan and Isolde to come together as lovers, while "Öd und leer das Meer," which Eliot places at the end of the Hyacinth Garden passage, announces Isolde's absence in Act 3. So the beginning and the end of the opera frame the Hyacinth passage. Eliot's chaste courtship of Hale 17 years before had nothing in common with the passionate adultery that Wagner's music celebrates. When Eliot wrote The Wasteland, however, he saw new parallels between his life and the opera. He and Hale were now separated by a vast ocean, das Meer, and by his mismatched marriage to another woman, giving his continued love for Hale an adulterous feel. Thinking back to his momentous night at the opera with her, he now perceived it as foretelling their tragic future, signaled by the presence of three prophetic figures in the poem, the Sibyl, Tiresias, and Madame Sosostris, who appears directly after this scene. The hyacinth lines thus contain a kind of palimpsest of the original moment of falling in love, shaped by subsequent longing, regret, and idealization. The Wagner frame is autobiographical, yet also elevates and universalizes the moment due to our own, the reader's, independent associations with this opera. Similarly, Eliot's allusion to Conrad's Heart of Darkness in The Heart of Light similarly lifts the moment out of ordinary life and places it in a realm of suggestion and mystery. Yet the word heart continues to wave its flag of personal emotion as it does in Gerontion and in Eliot's remark, "The poet wears his heart upon his sleeve." We can now see more clearly what Eliot means by transmutation, a process less like alchemy than camouflage, whereby he places moments of his own experience in a context so replete with possible significances, mythical, literary, and historical, that our imaginations are immediately led away from the poet to the ramifying meanings of his poem. Tracing this process need not rob the poem of its poetry, far from it. These revelations add another level of reference to a passage already saturated with meanings without depleting them. More importantly, the biographical context helps explain the emotional force that readers sense, even without knowing where it comes from. Perhaps the clearest instances of direct transmutation occur between Eliot's letters to Hale in the 1930s and his poetic sequences, Landscapes and Four Quartets. Using his letters as a kind of notebook, he describes experiences, sometimes shared with her, that he later placed in his poetry, whether a few months or a few years later, containing certain keywords from the original. For example, in 1936, he and Hale spent a week together at a beach house on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Some of these details are just so ordinary. Where, as he told her, "We could not have had a more satisfactory week as guests of people to whom I came as a complete stranger. That bell buoy is still tolling in my ears and calls up the long beaches, the seagulls, the pine grove, and the room where we sat on 2 afternoons." This bell buoy appears as the tolling bell of the dry selvages. And under the oppression of the silent fog, the tolling bell measures time, not our time, rung by the unhurried groundswell, a time older than the time of chronometers, older than time counted by anxious, worried women lying awake, calculating the future, trying to unweave, unwind, unravel, and piece together the past and the future between midnight and dawn, when the past is all deception, the future, futureless. Hale is no doubt, at least to my mind, there's no doubt that she is the model of these anxious, worried women, as she had fallen into a deep depression in spring 1936, following Eliot's repeated refusals to consider divorcing Vivian and moving forward in their relationship. Burnt Norton has its emotional center in the brief flowering of their romance in fall 1935, while The Dry Selvages records the painful unraveling of their happiness, as Hale absorbed her futureless future with the man who claimed to love her above all other women, but would take no steps to marry her. Eliot transmuted his personal experience at Woods Hole by moving the location of the poem up the Massachusetts coast to the seascape off Eastern Point, where he had spent his summers, The Dry Selvages, and by generalizing Hale from an individual woman to generations of anxious, worried women. Critics long assumed that these women were the mothers and wives of fishermen lost off the Grand Banks, and indeed, they are those women too, and stand in for humanity's passive suffering in the face of loss. One of the most interesting aspects of the transmutation process in this case is that while Eliot's letter to Hale is carefully correct, yet deviously misleading, "We could not have had a more satisfactory week." In other words, it wasn't that satisfactory, but given the circumstances, it couldn't have been better. The poem brings out the darkness of their time together, his understanding of Hale's suffering as she realized that the past was all deception, and his own guilt for leading her up to this point. I could speak at greater length about 4 quartets, now illuminated by memoir-like passages in his letters to Hale. However, to keep the focus on 1922, I'd like to return to The Wasteland and conclude by examining how Eliot also transmutes his grief for his father into something rich and strange in that poem. Indeed, grief, rather than longing for Hale, may be the primary emotional force behind The Wasteland. Thinking about Hale was a way of addressing his grief because, as I have mentioned, their shared Unitarian Boston Brahmin background and family ties caused him to associate her in his mind with his family. After his departure to England in 1914 and disastrous first marriage to a woman already addicted to painkillers, Eliot found himself looking to Hale as his link to a life he might have had in the United States, fulfilling his parents' hopes for him and remaining part of the family circle. Like Gerontian, The Wasteland indirectly approaches Eliot's grief for the father he felt he had disappointed. Henry Ware Eliot Sr. died in January 1919. In November, Eliot mentioned a poem I have in mind, his first documented reference to what became one of the great elegies of the 20th century. The proliferation of dead bodies and references to death have led critics to regard The Wasteland as a pastoral elegy in the tradition of Lycidas and When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. Understanding the poem's emotional wellspring as grief for the poet's father helps knit together our disparate ideas of the poem as a lament for the dead and a lover's complaint about having married the wrong woman. Hale is the figure who unites the two kinds of elegy, of love and mourning, because, as I propose, she was connected in his mind with his family, and recovering his feelings for her unlocked the tears he could not shed for his father. The fire sermon includes an explicit scene of mourning where a son grieves for his father. A rat crept softly through the vegetation, dragging its slimy belly on the bank while I was fishing in the dull canal on a winter evening round behind the gas house, musing upon the king, my brother's wreck, and on the king, my father's death before him. Like the Hyacinth Garden passage and the adulterated passage in Gerontian, these lines contain keywords of personal significance in a context pointing outward, away from himself. The literary context is, of course, the Tempest, already referred to earlier in the poem, here echoing Ferdinand's words about his father, the King of Naples, whom he believes drowned, sitting on a bank, weeping again the king, my father's wreck. Normally, when a poet writes, my father, and his father has just died, we assume the reference is at least partially to himself. But the word king directs our attention away from the present and the personal. King evokes Shakespeare and myth, especially the Fisher King legend that runs through the poem. Yet, as a captain of industry in Gilded Age St. Louis, Henry Ware Eliot Sr. was also a kind of king. And here's Eliot's mythic method, creating a continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity. Henry Ware Eliot entered the hydraulic press brick company in 1874 as its payroll master and gradually ascended the corporate ladder as the company grew, finally reigning as president from 1909 to his retirement in 1913, retaining the title of chairman until his death due to his importance as the company's largest stockholder. At the time of the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, Hydraulic turned out 300 million bricks per year in its 11 St. Louis yards. The company also operated subsidiaries in major cities throughout the U.S., especially in the Midwest. Brick dominated the construction industry in St. Louis, and Hydraulic produced brick for the city's streets, bridges, and residential and commercial buildings, including architectural landmarks. Hydraulic literally built the city, and Henry Ware Eliot Sr. was the company's leader during its most prosperous era. The Eliots formed something of a dynasty both in St. Louis, whose religious and educational institutions his grandfather had founded, and in Boston, where the president of Harvard, Charles William Eliot, was the poet's cousin. I don't know whether T.S. Eliot regarded himself as belonging to royalty, but he did sometimes address Emily Hale as princess, and in one letter praises her as a princess descended from so many royal kings. A quote, as you Shakespeareans already know, I'm sure, from Antony and Cleopatra, spoken after Cleopatra kills herself. The Hales belonged to the same cultural and social aristocracy as the Eliots, so it wouldn't have been outlandish for him to take a certain secret pride in their alliance as the spiritual union of a prince and princess. Yet the fire sermon passage in question hardly evokes a setting fit for a king or a prince. The speaker describes a repulsive industrial wasteland by a dull canal behind a gas house, with characteristic Eliotic irony, similar to enthroning the Cleopatra figure of a game of chess in a suffocating chemical haze, as well as suggesting that the speaker of these lines has fallen far from his father's social status. Placing royalty next to a gas house perfectly captures Gilded Age St. Louis. The city's architectural grandeur and economic power were achieved through environmental pollution and the exploitation of immigrant and black laborers who struggled for survival in slums not far from Eliot's childhood home on Locust Street. Indeed, Eliot called St. Louis as repulsive as ever after visiting it in 1933. Yet he also wrote to Hale at the same time, "Certainly the town was full of sadness for me, not so much on account of my mother as on account of my father. It was his city, not hers. He was born there and worked for it and died there, and also I shall be haunted by my last sight of him until my last day." Musing on the king, my father's death, Eliot is haunted by the memory of his father in the cityscape that belonged to him that he built as a captain of industry. The gas house is a detail of this passage that most readers pass over after registering the industrial character of the cityscape. Unlike coal smoke, coal gas production was not directly associated with brick manufacturing, but it was part of the same system that generated toxic pollution as a byproduct of wealth and comfort. 19th century gasworks, whose buildings were also called gas houses, converted solid coal to a gas used for lighting. By the end of the century, electricity was displacing coal gas, and the gas house gradually became an urban relic, replaced by other utility buildings, but leaving behind its chemical residues. One environmental historian estimates that St. Louis contained at least 54 gasworks and up to 150 additional sites related to coal gas manufacturing, often located near waterways to cleanse the unwanted and objectionable tars from the gas, and also in far too many cases as a discharge point for the toxic gas manufacturing liquid effluents. Thus, a canal stands behind the gas house of Eliot's poem, probably dull-colored because of the pollutants that were dumped or seeped into it. With gasworks scattered throughout the city, including near the hydraulic press brickyard on Spring Avenue, it's safe to say that Eliot first experienced gas houses and their associated pollution during his childhood and adolescence. The image of the poet musing on his dead father by a polluted canal behind a gas house symbolizes his complicated relationship to the city of his birth as well as to his father. Eliot owed his own auspicious start in life and continued domestic comfort to the hydraulic company, even after his father's death in the form of stock dividends. Beyond the son's personal feelings of guilt intertwined with grief, Eliot also registers the costs of a culture that depends on extraction and pollution. The son broods on his inheritance in a scene of natural destruction that includes the gas house and its aquatic wastes. The words father, gas house, and dull canal form a biographic skeleton beneath the poetic text. Further, Eliot's father died by water, in the sense that he lived and died by the banks of the Mississippi River, a body of water with great significance for Eliot, who wrote in 1930, "Missouri and the Mississippi have made a deeper impression on me than any other part of the world." Death by water need not mean only death by drowning, as in the psalm, "By the waters of Babylon," or Eliot's own rewriting of that psalm in the line, "By the waters of Leman, I sat down and wept," which was where Eliot went to recover from his depression and also from his grief for his father in 1921. Eliot's grief for his father runs like a subterranean river throughout the wasteland, neither explicitly articulated nor resolved. The poem's refusal of consolation makes it one of the first modernist elegies. Eliot had reasons to be melancholy. He believed he had disappointed his father by making a mess of his life. He had not said goodbye, and he recognized that he would probably never have children of his own. In mourning his father's death, the wasteland also mourns Eliot's own failure to become a father. The pastoral elegy evokes vegetation rituals that symbolize the ultimate consolation for death, the birth of another generation. The wasteland's desert landscapes and ambiguous withholding of rain suggest the failure of these rituals to regenerate plant and thus human life. And of course, the poem is populated by dysfunctional relationships that don't lead to generation. Eliot's failure to speak to Hale at the appropriate moment becomes, through the logic of the poem, his missed opportunity to have what Eudora Welty's traveling salesman calls a marriage, a fruitful marriage. That simple thing, anyone could have had that. The Hale letters open up opportunities to understand the ordinary emotional impulses behind Eliot's poetry in ways that, I hope, do not diminish its power as art. Now that we know more about his poems, can we look more tolerantly on his critical dicta? For generations, the impersonality theory was used to discourage precisely the kinds of readings that I have been offering here, readings he himself actually seems to have favored in private. I hope that the Hale letters will lead to treating Eliot less like an icon or a representative of modernism, of high culture, white privilege, or whatever we like or dislike, and more as a human being suffering universal experiences, such as grief for a father's death. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your lecture. And we have now a few minutes for questions. Yes?
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, we're all, I'm sure, delighted and privileged that you're sharing your first-hand knowledge of this massive correspondence, this recently revealed massive correspondence with us. I'm going to ask what I'm sure will be a very predictable question. I mean, because you were yourself hedging a number of things and qualifying the implications of, and of course, of taking texts from a very different writerly regime, such as private correspondence, to bear on poetry. But it's precisely because I'm sure you're all too aware of this that I will ask what may sound like the question of a devil's advocate, which is basically when we're dealing with a body of writing that the poet himself understood, as you were pointing, as something like a notebook, paralleling his other writings. What Porto calls a breathing can we adopt not to lose sight of this perception that a poet is not necessarily the best reader of his or her own verse. Private correspondence could be an exercise in self-delusion. If that were so, can we claim a sort of higher truth value for the correspondence? How shall we deal with this? Because we could do it the other way around and use the poems as a way of checking the correspondence, if we get skeptical, precisely, about this sort of privileged truth that the letters would contain. I'm sure people will have asked you this before.
Yes, they have, including Eliot scholars, who have resisted very much my account of the impersonal theory, because they do want to preserve Eliot's published work as having greater truth value, which it will probably always have for us. But I guess my answer to that would just be to say that there are two kinds of statements in Eliot's letters to Hale that bear on his poetry, and we should treat them differently, although I have actually treated them more or less the same in this more condensed lecture. Because he started writing to her in 1930, everything that he wrote from that point on either looked backwards or forwards to his poetry. So when he starts writing to her, he's very anxious or very intent on telling her what his poems meant that he has already published that she knows, and telling her where her place is in those poems. And you could say that, he's trying to make a case for himself as a lover by telling her, you're in my poems, I've always written for you, look at these places where you appear. And so we don't really, I guess we have to subject that to some scrutiny because he's telling that to a person he's trying to impress. Nonetheless, there is a fair amount of evidence, for the examples that I've given you, like external evidence about the fact that they went to this play, the opera together, and this was an important event for him. He saved the program his whole life. And so it seems likely, given what we know about the opera and its cultural place and its personal meaning to him, that is why he placed the Hyacinth Garden passage within the frame of the opera. And so I think that's probably one of the best examples of how you can use the letters sort of retrospectively, taking into consideration that he might have been biased, but still checking what he says in the letters against other forms of evidence to see what it can tell us about a poem that we already know quite well. The other kind of revelation in the letters is prospective, in the sense that Eliot is having experiences and he's writing them down in his letters to her. He always wrote to her as soon as they had parted, because their relationship was a long-distance one, and so they would see each other for visits, and then they would go apart from one another, and he would immediately write to her, and he would record some of the more important experiences, and he called them moments. Of course, that word moment becomes really important in four quartets. He would say, another moment was when, and actually, at a certain point, he buys a camera, and the snapshot, the idea of a snapshot is incorporated in his idea of a moment. And he sometimes sent her pictures from his visits to Little Gidding, for example, as moments within his experiences of these places. So he would record his experiences and send them to her, and we as scholars can then look at what he did with that raw material, turning it into poetry. So when he's recording those moments, he's not necessarily thinking about what he's going to do with that later on. he didn't originally intend to write 4 quartets. He just wrote Burnt Norton. And then it worked well, and so he he kept going. And he kept the relationship going, and a lot of the moments in their relationship fed into 4 quartets. So I think we bring different tools as scholars to those 2 different kinds of material that are in the letters. And I mean, there's no real answer to your epistemological concern about the truth value of letters versus the truth value of poetry, except to use the tools we have as scholars to try to be as certain as we can about whether, we're making things up or not. I don't know if that's not a very satisfying answer, but.
Yes, well, we can
yes, okay.
Extend this dialogue later. Yeah. Yes. I was wondering, this view expressed in the letters, as you pointed out, contradicts or qualifies the view expressed in the 1919 essay. Do the essays published since then seem to support a change towards the view expressed in the letters? I'm basing this on a series of remarks that Lewis makes in The Man Without Art, where he attacks Eliot's theory of impersonality and Ida Richard's idea of pseudo-beliefs, pseudo-statements, and argues that in the meantime, some of Eliot's essays seem to tend more towards accepting personality back. Is that also something that he would see in Eliot?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't made a thorough examination of it, but I think that's right. I think that he moved away from the impersonality theory in the sort of the kind of totalistic vocabulary that he uses in that essay. He doesn't really return to it, and I think he comes to a more nuanced view of poetry, or maybe he had that all along. But I think he was surprised by the importance that academics and scholars placed on that essay. I mean, it was only one of 1,000 pieces of prose that he published in his lifetime, but it came to have, through the anthologization process and his own publication process, it became his most important critical text, an importance that he himself may not have placed on it, but rather treated it as kind of like an explanatory accompaniment to Gerontian. So I think that's right.
Is it possible to think of 2 different theories of poetry, as you were saying, so personal and an impersonal? Because if we read the selected essays, not only he contends for impersonal theory of poetry, but the essays themselves are impersonal. The absence of this I, as we find in so many other essays, it's not there, it's not, or in a different way. So can you claim this? Because he published the selected essays and authors, pieces of literary criticism, where it seems very strong in his statement that poetry, or even literature in general, is impersonal. But the letters that you were addressing, they were not published. But can you claim that there is in there a theory, a personal theory, that stands in a way in opposition to his selected essays, or no, complementary?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by impersonal there. So, and I think that's part of the problem of the word, is it's really very vague. What does it mean, impersonal? What does that mean, right? So I think what you were saying is that his essays themselves have an impersonal presentation, in that he doesn't speak of himself. They're not personal essays. I mean, he's just kind of following the journalistic norms for literary criticism that we all follow pretty much still, right? That you don't insert yourself into your account of the meaning of literary works. I guess I would say they have a very strong personal presence, in that he's expounding his opinions and his tastes, and he's giving them a kind of apparatus, critical apparatus to support them, but mainly what characterizes those essays, especially in The Sacred Wood, that were the most impactful, is his selection of passages that he liked, and then his attempt to explain what was good about them, which is actually not how we do criticism at all now. I mean, you wouldn't let your students get away with that. So I guess I wouldn't necessarily agree that the essays are impersonal, because he does have such a strong, he makes his own presence really felt in those essays. I mean, what I want to do is to try to move away from all of the connotations that go along with impersonality that have been built up over 100 years of reading this essay and incorporating it in our criticism and as our critical vocabulary. When you look at what it actually seemed to have meant to him, which was simply sometimes as simple as changing people's names, which is mind-boggling. But anyway, I'm not sure I've really addressed your question.
Yeah, I guess. Just because, I mean, if you compare, for example, with Jim Luke's essays around the same time,
Yes.
Common Reading,
Mm-hmm.
I don't seem to find there the same arguments against personality in literature
Mm-hmm.
as you can find, especially in tradition in the time of the function of criticism.
Mm-hmm.
So he's distancing himself from a more personal point of view in selected passages.
Mm-hmm.
And he's doing the opposite, as I understood,
Yeah.
in the personal methods.
Right.
Or it can be read this way.
I mean, I guess I would say that his voice in the selected essays is it's arrogant, and it's very opinionated, and it's very masculine. And maybe we associate those qualities with impersonality, but they're not impersonal at all. I mean, they're very. He has a very strong personal presence that convinced people of his authority, even though it was often based on very little. You know, having not read the whole book or knowing very little of a language, he would make generalizations about it, which were just accepted because of the way that he expressed himself. Thank you so much for having me.